following subject matter is real and only intended for mature audiences. Discretion is advised.
People are dead after deputies say a man went on a shooting rampage.
I knew a week before she died I was going to kill her.
I can tell you the scene out there is absolutely horrific.
Nobody knows where this individual may strike next.
This is 10-Minute Murder.
Hello, welcome to 10-Minute Murder, brief and bingeable true crime. My name is Joe, I'm the host, and thanks for joining today. If you're new to 10-Minute Murder and or are not subscribed, take a moment to do that now, and you won't miss any future episodes. And coming in the very near future, an episode, probably a two-part episode, there's so much to cover on this one, the Menendez brothers. And since I'm on the subject of future stories, I've heard interest. A lot of you have been contacted. I say a lot, probably 3 or 4 people contacted me about doing the story on Brian Laundrie and Gabby Petito. And I strongly considered it. I don't think I'm going to do it, though, because if you're listening to this podcast, then that means you're into true crime a pretty good bit, enough to listen to a twice weekly podcast about true crime. And if you're into true crime, that means you probably already know all the details about this case. It's so recent and high profile, I don't know what I could possibly tell you that you couldn't otherwise already know. Eventually, I'll probably cover it, but as of right now, I'm going to put it on pause. But in reading up on that story, I learned something pretty disturbing. Did you know that during the course of the investigation for Brian and Gabby, the search parties and investigators out looking for them in the places that they could possibly be, the bodies of 9 other missing people were found. 9 other people that were missing were found dead, including one with a story that was very similar to Gabby. Emily Ferlazzo, who was 22 years old, was reported missing by her parents after her husband, Joseph Ferlazzo, who was 41 years old, returned to her parents' house in New Hampshire. It's a pretty big age gap there, 41 and 22. But like Laundrie and Petito, the Ferlazzos were traveling together, living in a small bus they converted into a home. And Joseph reportedly confessed to shooting her in the head and dismembering her body in the camper. Authorities reportedly found the camper and the bags of human remains, a handgun, and a handsaw. And the remains were shipped to the medical examiner for identification. And Joseph pled not guilty, despite admitting to it earlier. So that's still obviously an ongoing case. But I'll post a link to the story of the 9 people that were found in search of Gabby Petito. I'll put that on the 10-Minute Murder Facebook page so you can read up on that. And now to today's story. In 1995, a murderer crisscrossed the U.S. for 6 weeks, seducing redheaded women he met in bars before brutally murdering them. Also known as the Casanova Killer, cops tracked his every step before they were finally able to catch him after a classic high-speed chase on a highway. But what authorities did not yet know was that the killer, a man named Glen Rogers, had much more to tell them than they expected. Glen Edward Rogers was born July 15, 1962, in Hamilton, Ohio. He was the 6th of 7 total children of Edna and Claude Rogers. For unknown reasons, Glen would often sit and rock back and forth during his infant years and continually bang his head against walls and any other hard surfaces, never once crying. His emotional abilities seemed limited, but he adapted and learned how to hide his shortcomings. Still, it was a miracle Glen even lived past infancy based on how he was handled as a child. His redheaded mother once slapped him so hard he passed out and often tied his arms to restrain him. When Glen learned how to set himself free, he ate paint chips off the walls to satisfy his hunger. Things weren't going well in the Rogers household, and I'm not one that would normally criticize how parents parent their children, but Edna seemed super unchill, and I don't know what she thought she was doing. When Glen was just 3 years old, Edna held his head under the water during bath time, but decided to pull him up just before it was too late. Glen didn't stop wetting the bed before he was 12 years old, and at that same age, he became addicted to drugs, introduced to him by his older brother Clay. To support their habits and possibly just to have fun, the two also began burglarizing houses. It took 200 robbed houses before Glen was sent to reform school due to his criminal behavior. A year later, Glen found naked photographs of his mother. Apparently, that was reason enough for him to attempt suicide by overdosing on 25 Motrin pain reliever tablets. However, he obviously survived. A while later, doctors learned that Glen had an unusual blood disorder that appeared when he became upset or angry about things he had no control over. As a result, he would break out in these red splotches all over his face and arms, hands, and chest. The disease is called porphyria. I'm probably saying that wrong, Porphyria. It's the same one that George III, the Mad King of Great Britain and Ireland, suffered from. Growing up in an abusive family caused Glen to develop a gregarious, outgoing personality to mask his low IQ and insecurity. Glen loved to tell stories of his experiences in life. He just made them bigger and better and a little more dramatic than they really actually were. Glen often lied or at least stretched the truth, even though his family members quickly caught on. His stories helped to attract attention at school among those who didn't already know him yet. Still, his gift for storytelling did not match his skills in school. There, Glen was exceptional only for his poor performance. He found reading difficult and never really got the hang of it. And as you can expect, Glen's problems with printed words affected the rest of his schoolwork, and he quickly fell behind the other children of his age. So Glen found better things to do, like slipping off with some of his buddies to the woods behind their school to do drugs and drink. Glen also kept getting into fights at school, which is not super uncommon for boys to do. However, by the time he entered his teens, he'd picked up a reputation for being an explosive and violent-tempered person. On the other hand, Glen was also known as a ladies' man. Not a very good combo. Somehow he had this instinctive knowledge of how to make girls like him. He would flatter some of them to the point where they would do almost anything. Meanwhile, Glen's academic success was still non-existing, and by his 16th birthday, he was expelled for school for an unknown reason. He had been in the 9th grade with F's in every single subject. By the age of 18, Glen was married to Deborah Ann Nix, with whom he had 2 children. However, the marriage was anything but happy, and Debbie was constantly abused by her husband. And when Glen got angry, he didn't just slap or push. Instead, he straight on smashed her in the face and body with his fist and kicked her with his feet. Once, Glen even sent Debbie to the hospital after he'd beaten her up and kicked her in the crotch with one of his steel-toed work boots just because he thought she had been cheating. After the incident in Ohio, Rogers became a drifter, ending up in the Los Angeles area in the early 1990s. There he worked odd jobs and continued what he did best, to woo women. In September 1995, Glen met Sandra Gallagher, a 33-year-old mother of 3, at a bar in Van Nuys. Sandra is out celebrating a $1,200 lottery win. However, her celebration didn't last long, as her dead body was found in her burning pickup truck the following morning. Glen again felt the need to change the scenery, so he ended up in Jackson, Mississippi, where he continued to use his charm and eventually seduced and moved in with a woman named Linda Price. On November 3rd, 1995, the 34-year-old Linda was found dead in her bathtub, stabbed to death. Just 4 days later, Tina Marie Cribbs was found murdered by multiple stab wounds in a motel in Tampa, Florida, where Glen Rogers had been a guest. You can see the pattern forming here. When 37-year-old Andy Giles Sutton was then discovered on November 9th, 1995, also stabbed to death in her apartment in Bossier City, Louisiana, police began to realize that they had a serial killer on the loose. A man named Glen Rogers was soon linked to the slayings across several states. Finally, a nationwide manhunt was issued for the so-called Casanova Killer. On November 14th, 1995, police spotted Glen in Kentucky, and a 13-mile chase ensued. Glen led authorities at speeds of 100 miles per hour before police cars finally forced him off the road by ramming their patrol car into Glen's stolen vehicle, ending his deadly crime spree. While in custody, Glen confessed and bragged that he had actually killed over 70 people. However, he quickly recanted the statement, claiming he was just joking and had not committed any murders at all. We'll most likely never know the actual number of murders that he committed, but we do know for sure Glen was responsible for at least 5 deaths, including that of 71-year-old Mark Peters back in Ohio. As his female victims were redheads, one would think Glen used his resentment towards his mother as an incentive for the murders. Before his trial, authorities assessed Glen and diagnosed him with chronic psychotic disturbance. The Wechsler test further showed evidence of brain damage, which is not really surprising. As you know, the man banged his head against the walls and possibly ate lead paint as a child. The test also indicated Glen's IQ was 76, 6 points above mental retardation. Despite his mental health issues, Glen stood trial for murder and received the death penalty in 1997. Later, he received another death sentence in 1999 in California. That could have been the end of Glen Rogers' story, but of course, there was more to come. In 2012, his brother Clay took part in releasing a television documentary called My Brother the Serial Killer. In the documentary, Clay made a claim that sent shockwaves around the country. According to him, Glen was the one responsible for the high-profile murders of Nicole Brown Simpson and Ronald Goldman in 1994. The case was one of the most famous crimes of the 20th century, and to this day, everyone has their own opinion as to whether or not O.J. Simpson was really behind it all. Allegedly, Glen told those close to him that he worked at Nicole Brown Simpson's house as a painter and planned to take her down because she was rich. The LAPD did investigate Glen, but obviously in the end, he was not charged with those murders. As a result, we can only guess if Rogers really had something to do with the slayings or if it was just all one crazy fictional story, like he had always made up for his entire life to be the center of attention. Only time will tell if the whole truth ever comes out. Meanwhile, Glen Rogers remains on death row at Union Correctional Institution in Florida. A date has not yet been set for his execution. That's 10-Minute Murder for today. Brief and bingeable true crime. Thanks for listening. And like I mentioned at the beginning, if this is your first time listening, or if you have not yet taken an opportunity to subscribe to 10-Minute Murder, I invite you to do that now. It'll just take a moment and you won't miss any future episodes of the podcast. Also, you can connect with 10-Minute Murder on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. Links for that are in the show notes of this episode, or just as easily, you can go to any of those and type in 10-Minute Murder into the search bar, and the podcast will be right there. As of me saying these words right now that you're hearing them, we are 2 episodes deep into the new series of Dexter on Showtime. I'm pretty excited about it. I think it's going great so far. And if you're not a fan of Dexter and don't watch the show, I don't know what you're doing with your life and why you don't like cool things, but check it out. I promise you're going to like it. And no, this isn't sponsored. I wish Dexter would sponsor me. Thank you for listening to 10-Minute Murder. Stay safe and have a good night.
10-minute murder. 10-minute murder. 10-minute murder. 10-minute murder.